Hi, everyone. Welcome to our video series on GDPR, the topic that's on every marketer's mind these days. Today, the Iterable team will share their expertise on what GDPR means for your business and what steps you should take right now to ensure your company's compliance. My name is Alyssa Jarrett. I'm the Senior Content Marketing Manager at Iterable, and I will be serving as your moderator today. I'm joined by my colleagues Will Gregorian and Sarah Gounder from our compliance team. Will serves as Iterable's Chief Information Security Officer. He brings 14 years of technology operations and information security experience, having served as the Director of Security at Omada Health, and most recently as the Chief Information Security Officer at BlackRock's Future Advisor before joining Iterable. Sarah serves as Iterable's Compliance Manager. She brings a JD as well as a strong marketing background to Iterable. Prior to attending law school in the Bay Area, she spent 5 years as a marketer for CBS Radio, ending her tenure as a director. So thanks to both of you for joining us. Let's get started. So Will, what is GDPR anyway? Why don't you walk us through it?
Yeah, happy to. Hi, everybody. To answer your question, Alyssa, GDPR is the successor to the 1995 Data Protection Directive. GDPR was finalized by the European Commission in April of 2016, giving organizations a 2-year grace period before it becomes applicable on May 25, 2018. Its core intent is to strengthen data privacy and protection of any individual residing within the EU. And unlike its predecessor, the regulation binds all EU member states, not requiring the member states to pass a national legislation as it is the case with EU directives. Ultimately, GDPR harmonizes data protection requirements within the EU. The main focus of GDPR is to create stricter responsibilities for organizations to demonstrate adequate processes for the management and protection of personal data, guaranteeing individuals the fundamental rights to privacy. For the rest of us outside of the EU, personal data means any information relating to a person's professional or public life, ranging from a name, email address, bank details, posts on social media websites, medical information, and even IP addresses. The new obligations apply to any organization that handle data of individuals residing in the EU, whether the organization is EU-based or not. Obviously, striking a balance between growth, marketing needs, and privacy takes the front seat and becomes even more crucial in compliance since GDPR in a direct and indirect way requires businesses to limit the collection and storage of personal data. Finally, it's important to point out some key data points on GDPR before moving on. It introduces 7 fundamental rights for individuals. It affects 200 plus countries across the globe. It introduces a common data breach notification window of 72 hours, and it requires organizations to appoint a data protection officer, otherwise known as a DPO, which is a mandatory step for businesses of 250 employees or more. It requires the mandatory data protection impact assessment, DPIA, a topic we'll discuss in the coming weeks. And finally, it requires security and privacy by design when establishing processes and systems.
All right, that's a really great overview, Will. You know, there are a lot of definitions within GDPR. And Sarah, I wanted to ask you, what are the differences between data subjects, data controllers, and data processors? Why don't you walk me through that?
That's a great question, Alyssa. So a data subject is a natural person. And for the marketer, this would be the customer or the prospect. Now, GDPR requirements will require marketers to change the way that they process, store, and protect customer personal data. So let's dive a little deeper into personal data. Personal data, as defined under the GDPR, is any data that directly or indirectly identifies a natural person. This can include identifiers that are physical, physiological, genetic, mental, a location, socioeconomic, and cultural. A data controller is an organization that determines the purpose and means of processing personal data. A data processor is an organization that works with a data controller to process personal data on the controller's behalf. So let's break this down into an easier example. If Nestle sells chocolates to consumers and uses a marketing automation system like Iterable to track consumer engagement activities, Nestle becomes the data controller and Iterable would become the data processor.
Yeah, that's a really great way to explain it. Another question that a lot of people have are just the general principles of GDPR. So, Will, do you want to dive in deeper into that?
Obviously, we can't talk about GDPR without mentioning the general principles. So I'll start from the top. When processing a subject's data, the activity needs to be conducted lawfully, fairly, and transparently. And ultimately, what this means is marketers must have legitimate grounds for collecting data without negatively impacting and affecting an individual's expectations. The fair and lawful principle is to provide consumers transparency of how their data will be used. And as an example, as growth marketers collect consumer information to tailor an outreach campaign, they'll want to precisely explain how and when that information is going to be used, which in turn helps individuals remain informed about the information they're sharing with the organization. Next, we'll talk about the data controllers and the processors and how they should use the data per the subject's expectations. And to summarize, the limitation principle states the collection of personal data meant for one purpose cannot be utilized for a new and incompatible purpose. It's worth noting under GDPR, marketers can use personal data for further processing for scientific and statistical purposes, but not without additional safeguards as described in Article 89 of the GDPR. In practice, a popular online retailer like Apple can market their new iPhone to existing customers. However, unless their customers have agreed to this, Apple cannot and will not be able to cross promote other product lines or pass customer details to third parties without prior consent. Data controllers and processors must maintain a minimally required data set to conduct business activities. Data minimization limits data acquisition and storage to what's necessary. The personal data an organization stores on consumers should be adequate for the purpose it's storing the information. Under GDPR, data should be limited to what's necessary, which means marketers should carefully review the data they need to achieve their marketing goals. In practice, when someone cancels a service subscription, the service provider should only maintain the minimal data set on the subscriber for record keeping purposes while also making sure their third party service providers have complied with the data subject request in equal measure. In the case of Iterable, we supplied the necessary API actions to ensure compliance with data erasure, events, and exports. This means marketers shouldn't process personal data longer than it's necessary for business purposes. Moving on to the next item, data controllers and processors must ensure accuracy of the subject's data. Marketers should make sure personal data that they process is always accurate and up to date, meaning they need to clearly describe options to allow consumers to change their personal data, including providing a means for individuals to exercise their right to be forgotten and tracked. In practice, this means when you're running an email campaign under GDPR, you must inform your consumers how to exercise their right to be forgotten, ergo an opt-out link, which subsequently removes their data. And that means you must remove all records that is no longer necessary for processing. Under the data minimization principle, you may be able to hold on to metadata to ensure compliance and safe record keeping.
Yeah, thanks for wrapping that up. Another question I have for Sarah, what are the latest rights of the data subject?
Sure. So first and foremost, the data subject has the right to inquire into what the data controller will do with their personal data. They also have the right to request at any time a copy of their personal data that a controller or processor stores. As a part of their rights, they also have the right to understand the business's justification for why a data controller may be storing their personal data and how long they may keep it. And finally, the data subject has the right to request that any inaccuracies in their personal data be corrected by data controllers and erased upon their request. So for example, I as a data subject use Zillow to search for my dream home. Zillow uses Iterable to track engagement and subsequently processes its customer personal data through the Iterable platform. Zillow is the data controller and Iterable is the data processor. If I then under GDPR request to be forgotten and erased, Zillow will need to send a request to Iterable to have my personal data erased. And due to Iterable's back-friendly API calls, this can actually happen pretty instantly.
Awesome, that's super cool. So what are the new responsibilities for businesses?
That's a great question, especially for the marketer. So GDPR is going to ensure accountability by demonstrating compliance. And really what that means is it'll establish a proper governance and policy framework that is repeatable and thorough. It'll also ensure data protection and privacy by design, meaning when you procure or design a system, you have to ensure the appropriate privacy controls are a part of that system. So for example, a privacy by design when using Facebook would be all privacy settings in your profile. You'll also want to perform vendor due diligence of any third-party processor. And a part of your due diligence should include reviewing the necessary contractual requirements to ensure compliance with GDPR and assessing the right questions, such as, do you know who your vendors are? Do you know which vendors you're sharing data with? Which data elements are you sharing? And have you mapped out where your data is flowing to? If your organization employs over 250 people or stores certain types of data, maintain an audit trail of processing that is accessible by the regulators at any time. And lastly, in a data breach scenario, disclose it to your local regulator and all data subjects within 72 hours.
All right, so that's a lot of responsibilities for a lot of businesses out there. And I guess it really begs the question, well, how is it going to affect the daily lives of marketers?
So GDPR is actually going to improve the lives of marketers through data quality. And it's going to do this by requiring marketers to understand prospect and customer needs better. You see, with GDPR, you do need explicit consent to use an individual's data. And through consent, the marketer will gain insight into each individual's interests to provide them with information that they want to receive. So with that improved data quality, marketers will need to develop a deeper understanding of prospect and customer behavior. And lastly, GDPR is actually going to build trust through transparency. So over 90% of online shoppers cite that security of their personal data is a concern. And through GDPR's requirements, marketers will demonstrate that data is being held securely and therefore strengthen trust and engagement with their customers and prospects. So it's actually a good thing.
So Sarah, why don't you elaborate on that? If our viewers here had to do 3 things right now to prepare for GDPR, what should those be?
Well, first and foremost, you want to determine if your organization falls within the scope of GDPR. So is your organization processing or handling personal data within the EU? Secondly, you want to gain a sense of what data your organization is processing. So are you storing or transmitting data that directly or indirectly identifies a natural person? And then thirdly, you want to establish your GDPR governance framework. So Will, how would you recommend marketers approach their GDPR plan of action?
That's a really good question. From a marketer's perspective, you'll want to work on awareness. Make sure decision makers in your organization are aware that the regulation is changing, and make sure that they need to appreciate the impact that is likely to have identify areas that could cause compliance problems under GDPR. Second to that, partner with your legal team. Review your existing communication privacy notices. When you collect personal data, you currently have to give people certain information, such as your identity and how you intend to use their information. This is usually done through a privacy notice. Under the GDPR, there are some additional things you'll have to tell people. For example, you will need to explain your lawful basis for processing their data, your data retention periods, and the individuals have the right to complain to the Information Commissioner's Office, otherwise known as an ICO. The GDPR requires the information to be provided in a concise, easy to understand, and clear language. So basically, no legalese that most average people cannot understand. Partner with your security and privacy teams. It's always been a good practice to adopt a privacy by design approach and carry out a privacy impact assessment, otherwise known as a PIA, as part of this. However, GDPR makes privacy by design an express legal requirement under the term the data protection by design, and by default, it makes PIA referred to as a data protection impact assessment, or DPIA, mandatory in certain circumstances.
All right, and finally, because we believe in practicing what we preach here at Iterable, Will, can you walk us through what Iterable's GDPR strategy is?
Great question. First off, the Iterable API provides the necessary calls to accommodate data controllers and subject requests. As it stands, our API has the means to allow the erasure, export of events, and the modification of data subject for some time now. As a data processor, we have been revamping our security and privacy program to make sure we've aligned our governance posture from a regulatory perspective. Controls and governance program effectiveness will be reflected in future SOC 2 audits as we go through the audit period. We're also conducting a data impact assessment, which I alluded to previously, a DPIA, to ensure Iterable has in equal measure identified its third parties that may store, transmit, or process subject data. We're also undergoing a thorough assessment of all Iterable vendors to ensure compliance.
That's great news. All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Please stay tuned in the coming months for much more information on GDPR. We're going to continue to walk you through this process and guide you along the way prior to the deadline and thereafter. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at compliance@iterable.com. We would be happy to help. Thank you and have a great day.